Welcome to Minding the Gap video podcast series, where we will talk about how stress creates gaps between us and how we can use our minds to close those gaps instead of widen them. I'm Paul Bakke with Behavioral Sciences of Alabama, and I'm with Dr. David Barnhart, and I want to welcome everybody to our first podcast and video, hopefully in a series where we can help people understand about stress and how to deal with it a little bit better. How you doing today, Dr. Barnhart? I see that you did not wear your Hawaiian shirt like you said you were going to.
I am sorry to let you down, but maybe the next time we'll have the Hawaiian shirt on, and then you can let me down. Then we'll be squared away.
Sometimes our minds forget.
We always have a constraint. And part of the constraint is what we refer to as working memory. And that may be a little bit confusing, but essentially it's the space where we have conscious awareness. And the constraint is that we're limited in how much we can have in our conscious awareness at one time. Where working memory is concerned, it's maybe 5 to 7 chunks of information. The problem is that when we're under stress, we're even more constrained. So if on a good day, we're able to say, hang on to 5 to 7 chunks of information, and maybe part of that information is that I'm going to control my emotions when I'm having a conversation with my kid about finishing the classwork they had from their Zoom meeting this morning. And on my way to do that, something else happens. You know, the dog knocks over its water bowl or something, and that occupies my space. And so by the time I get around to having this conversation with my kid, I'm even more limited. And so the stress of the moment and the urgency to get stuff done so we can get on with our day comes together, and I end up irritated and sounding irritated with my kid.
And it may not have anything to do with your kid.
Yes.
Because in this podcast, we're going to talk about all kinds of sources of stress, gaps created, how we widen them with our behavior, with our thinking, how we can close the gaps. But I think everybody in the world can relate to this idea of the COVID that's created this stress. And just like you said, has exacerbated normal stuff and our ability to reason, to use our working memory, to make decisions that are rational, sometimes become sort of hijacked. So what I want you to talk to our listeners and our viewers about and explain to them is what happens when we're triggered by some stressful event in our minds. What's the process of how we interpret that, how we process that, and how ultimately it ends up in our behavior.
So we like to talk about brain processes a little bit here because, and we don't really have to know about the neurology of this in order to know that we can be effective in our approach. We can train ourselves to respond even under stressful circumstances to be more like the people that we desire to be. But I think it's useful to think about how the brain works a little bit here. And so when we think about triggers, first of all, the overarching COVID situation that we're in is always at the back of our minds or at the front of our minds, depending on where we are. And that brings along a certain level of stress. Now, why is that important? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is it occupies space in my attention. Another is that my body responds by producing cortisol, stress hormone, which has an impact on things like processing speed and other things. And so my emotional control would maybe not be as high as it might be otherwise, just the overarching issue. So here we go. So we got this kind of overarching vulnerability, let's say, and then there's a trigger of some kind that's a stress trigger. And, maybe it's, my kid's not getting down to the Zoom meeting in time for the start of class. And so part of my brain, and we have these sensory inputs that then are routed to different places in the brain. And there's a part of our brain that's set up to be a threat detector. The amygdala is often associated with that particular system. So we've got this threat detection system, and it's set up to really keep us out of trouble and fundamentally to help us survive. And while our kid not coming down to start their Zoom meeting may not be a threat to our survival, in a sense, it is a threat because it impacts our day-to-day existence and how we carry on our lives. So we can have an automated response to that we would prefer to maybe be rational in our response. Well, we want to be effective.
And it's a threat. It's a threat to the schedule. It's a threat to my child getting a good grade. It's a threat to him being responsible or her being responsible. It's a threat to values that we have as parents, because we want our kids to do well in school, to be on time, to do their work, to work hard, because we want them ultimately to be successful. So it's ultimately a threat to their their livelihood and their success. And in that instant, we're not, consciously thinking about that, but that's really what it represents.
Well, and it can come out, and it can come out as a lecture. And what you just shared could be a part of that lecture. Unfortunately, that doesn't really change behavior. It tends to reinforce the behavior because it's attention to behavior that we prefer not to see. So it's stimulating to the child. We end up reinforcing or strengthening the behaviors that we don't really want. Right. What we would like to do is to be able to be prepared so we could think about how we want to think and how we want to behave in that particular instance. I always think about this. Paul, we have this painting on the wall in our waiting room. That's a quote from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust. He was a Jewish psychiatrist. And this is what he said. He said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. When I read that, when I think about that, I see that space is really pretty tiny. The amazing thing about our brains is we can learn to take advantage of that really tiny space. In order to do that, we have to be reflective. We have to think about, well, how do I set this up so that my kid comes down and starts their Zoom class on time?
Or how do we respond if he doesn't?
Yes. our
because
our tendency.
you're trying to create conditions that would make it
Yeah.
most likely that he would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to be prepared for he might not.
That's true. And our focus tends to be on that part, on what happens if he doesn't. And our orientation will tend toward consequences that are really more punishment oriented than teaching oriented. And that's kind of wired in to our training and the way we've been reared culturally. We have a real orientation toward consequences that may be more punishment oriented or removal of privilege oriented. And I'm not saying that we wouldn't provide a consequence like that, but that doesn't really train in what it is we're looking for, because what we're looking for would be the positive opposite. So instead of non-compliance, we're looking for compliance. How do we set it up so that this child is more likely to come down on time? And how do we strengthen that response so that's the one that's probably going to occur? And if I do that, if I set it up, then I also am in the process of training my brain. So when I get the signal that he didn't come down, I know how I'm going to respond, but I also know how I'm going to respond to set it up so that I increase the probability. We have historically referred to this as using the high road, which is kind of top-down regulation, using our thinking, the thinking part of our brain to down-regulate the part that gets excited by the threat so that we can use our reasoning and our usual charming behavior to strengthen the tendency of our kid to be compliant.
Well, that's one of the things is that you're talking about the tiny space, because the tiny space is sort of represented by the fact that the feeling part, the upset part of this is not working the way I want to, that's first.
Yes.
That happens first. And
yes.
so there's nothing we can do about that. We're not going to like it. We're not going to be initially calm sometimes.
Right.
So being able to ride that out and access the thinking part by practice, like you were saying, is important. And I'll use an example of one of my clients was really having a hard time with his son, who was just having these meltdowns all the time, and a very rational guy. He came to me, he was wanting to deal with his anger. I'm getting angry. I know it's not good. I know it's making it worse, but I'm just getting so angry with him. And so I asked him about what he was thinking on the way home. And he said, I'm thinking, it's been a tough day. I hope he's good. I hope he doesn't have a meltdown,
Right.
I hope he's, so he's setting himself up for as soon as the kid started to show any sign that he might have a meltdown, he would go, hey, he would get on his case, and try to correct him and lecture him or do something that was very intense. And of course, what do you think happened? The kid would have a meltdown.
Sure.
So he began practicing thinking, he's going to have a meltdown when I get home. It's going to happen. In fact, I'm going to be ready for it. I'm going to be ready for it, and I'm going to be calm, and I'm going to, just, okay, well, and create this situation that's safe for him. I can't control him, but I can give him choices. And so we talked about that. And that's a big part of this process too, is providing choices. If the child doesn't do what they're supposed to do, there's a choice. And parents being okay with the child choosing the wrong thing. And then that's when the consequence happens. They basically made the choice. And we talk about this a lot, how when you tell somebody they're going to do something and demand it, what does a child do? Sticks his foot in the dirt and defends himself or herself. And so the combination of being prepared for the situation, making it conditions so that it's likely that this behavior is going to be positive, but also going, okay, it might not go well, and I'm going to focus on my response and provide choices, gives the opportunity for a lesson to be learned either way. You learn a lesson that if I do this, I'm not going to get what I want, the child does. Or if I do this, I do get what I want. And what they're also learning by the parent being calm and providing choices and not reinforcing the behavior with, that you're going to do this and the anger, is that it's safe for me to make a mistake. That my parent isn't going to put me on the defensive. Because at the same time, the parent has got these chemicals going through their brains, the child does too. And they're not as good as regulating their emotion as we are.
And we're not as good as we would like to be.
No.
Yeah. Adults have have a lot of difficulty with the same thing. And part of the issue has to do with how connected the parts of our brain where we make decisions about things and we downregulate behaviors, called the prefrontal cortex primarily. And that part of the brain, by the time we're 25, actually. So we're really kind of adolescent until we're 25. Now, when I heard this as a graduate student at the age of 22, I was insulted because I had a professor that talked about this, and he said, "Hey, we're really, adolescent till we're about 28." And I'm the youngest person in the class. Everybody else was older, going back to graduate school, and I'm 22, and I was really upset. But now I get it. That's true. 25, we have more maturity. The prefrontal cortex is more engaged with the reactionary, the impulsive tendency. So we have more control. And I like to use this example of insurance companies, companies that insure automobiles drop their rates when you become about 25. And it's not because they study neuroscience, but they do look at statistics, and they notice that people had fewer accidents. They had fewer speeding tickets. There was less impulsive, reckless driving when people hit 25. And so if you want to keep them as customers, you drop the rate, because other insurance companies notice the same thing. They're going to pull those people away from you. So the rates go down when you reach 25. Well, that's an indication of reaching a level of maturity. And when we see that and we realize that we're dealing with an 8 or a 9 or a 10 or a 17-year-old, they don't have that level of emotional regulation. And I'm certainly a lot older than 25, and I can be triggered too, So parents can be frustrated. And if we think about how we regulate, and then we expect a 10, 8, or 17-year-old to regulate themselves, that's not really a logical conclusion.
Yeah,
so the question is, well, how do we increase the probability that that we will behave the way we would like to behave, but how can we set it up so that our children and our teenagers are more likely to learn how to be responsible and how to downregulate their reactions to things as well.
And that's why it's important to constantly, as a parent, be thinking about what you said earlier, the positive opposite. What is it that I want to reinforce? What's the opposite of this behavior? Everything in my brain is telling me to get angry and upset about this bad behavior because of this threat. And so, like what you're saying, thinking about it beforehand in terms of they're going to make mistakes, they're impulsive, they're going to go by feel, as part of their nature. So accepting, and using these as teachable moments to be able to talk about and focus on, this is what I want, instead of too much focus on, stop doing that. You need to know better than that. You're mine, and you should know better, and all that stuff that we do, that we go, we all do. And thankfully my kids are, 21 and 23. I've made all the mistakes, I've met all of them, and I could see, sometimes, that, other kids, they misbehave and they do stuff, and that's fine. But mine, that's not mine, and so we're never going to be unemotional about our kids. We're always going to be, want the best for them, be threatened by anything that's negative for them. Disrespect, it's going to be, you're going to disrespect me, but if we can step back and think, what's the lesson? What's the positive opposite that I can reinforce? That's not a natural thing to do. That takes some planning.
It does.
Thinking about.
Let's look at that a little bit, because we have focused on the issue that that tends to sustain the problem. And if we're gonna do an intervention, then we look at, well, how do you bring in the positive opposite so it's more likely to occur? Examples would be, for example, let's say I have a teenager, and I would like for that teenager to mow the grass. Okay, and so I have a conversation with him or her, and I say, well, Saturday morning, would like for you to go ahead and get the grass mowed. I'm going to be out in the morning, and there's rain in the forecast for a little later, so make sure that you get it mowed before it rains. Okay, and so I go off for the morning, and sure enough, it rains, and I come back and the grass isn't mowed. Okay. Well, I didn't really set it up. It sounded like I was making a plan, but I didn't really set it up. So what would have to occur in order for that teenager to be motivated to get it done? And so we think about, well, maybe I need to have a little more of a conversation, and let's think about how to reinforce that behavior. Imagine this. Imagine that I'm a parent that's at home with a kid and want to get the grass mowed. And so kid gets up and I say, hey, you want me to make you some a special lunch after you mow the grass? Would you like waffles and strawberries? I mean, I don't know. So you think about saying yes to the hard thing on the way to the good thing. So it has a little more of a positive spin. Do you want me to make breakfast for you before you mow the grass? So you say yes to the hard thing, right? And there's it's easier to say yes if you set it up in the right way. So that's
and it's connected to something. And we're talking about the threats earlier.
Yes, right.
So the threat can be, my kid's not doing what they're supposed to do.
Uh-huh.
All those kinds of things we talked about. But a threat to a kid too is, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't feel like it. I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. No, nobody, jumps up and down about, doing a chore and things like that. So that, asking for responsibility sometimes represents something uncomfortable, aka a threat. And so you're connecting a potential threat or uncomfortable situation with something positive. Talk about the power of that just in your brain and our minds.
Yeah. So we, and ultimately what we're trying to do is have responsibility be associated with positive outcomes. And so we want to be intelligent about setting up responsibilities or chores or making requests initially so that the child or the teenager is making that connection. Good things happen to me when I'm more responsible.
Right.
To get it started, we have to be, pretty task oriented in order to start making that conditioned response.
Well, sometimes I talk about the stages of change, and state 3 would be preparation, the practice. It's trial and error. You're not really committed to the change yet, but you're going to see. And what makes someone go from that stage to action, which is I'm doing it because it's good for me. I'm not doing it because my mom says to do it. I'm not doing my counselor says to do it. I'm doing it because it helps me. And so that takes a lot of reinforcement. If the child does the responsible thing, mows the yard, does the homework, and they consistently see this is good for me, that's when you have a change that says, I like this. This feels good. I'm not afraid of doing my homework. I'm not afraid of doing a chore. I'm not, it doesn't bother me because I see that it helps me and I get stuff for it. And eventually, and we talked to some parents about, rewarding, and we've even talked about, when a behavior is really difficult to get, that you're really trying to get to, coming up with some out there kind of rewards like ice cream for breakfast,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know about that. I don't want to teach them that that's okay. You're not going to have to give ice cream for breakfast forever. Eventually they're going to feel good about, this is good.
I stayed in bed all night. Yes. I stayed in my own bed.
Right. Yeah, I stayed in my bed all night and I got it. And so eventually there's no substitute for them actually doing the thing and seeing that they can do it. They can, that it's actually good for them. Or if it's a fearful thing, like where we talk about anxiety with child getting out of bed, coming in, wanting to sleep with mom and dad and that kind of thing, that where it's fear-based, they learn that, I did it. It started out with ice cream, but it turned into, the threat was taken away because I was okay. And that's the way change happens. It's by behavior. And so that motivational carrot in the beginning is really important. And if you want to get some buy-in, there better be something that's meaningful to them. And they're not typically going to be motivated by a lecture and, and the anger that what's happening with us is we're letting that anxiety out. We're letting that out. That's not about helping the child. It's about we're dealing with our own stress in a way that, it's helpful in the moment for us because it feels better, this release, but it doesn't really help what we're trying to do.
Right.
Change some behavior.
Well, I think it would be helpful maybe in a future episode to talk really specifically about what we call the antecedent events, setting up, and maybe during this time where parents are home with their kids, going to school and trying to get homework done, maybe we could focus on some strategies for helping that and reduce the stress. So the parents have some strategies in mind, and a little more confidence about their abilities to manage those situations. And maybe at the same time, talk about how to communicate when things don't go well so that we don't make it worse.
Right.
There's some really good resources for this. There's a book by John Gottman called Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child. There's a book by Alan Kasdan called The Everyday Parenting Toolkit. Those are two resources that we found have really been useful because they focus on setting things up, how to help children be successful, deals with the consequences when they don't do well, but also how to communicate in ways that sustain a positive relationship with the child.
Right. Well, and it all starts, no matter what we're talking about, with stress, and we're going to get into a lot of different topics. It starts with this intuition, this immediate detection of a threat,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's my kid's not doing what they're supposed to do, that's not good, whether it's, for a child, I don't feel like doing it, or whatever it is. And so all the strategies are really about taking away the threat, recognizing it for what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and using these things as teachable moments with parents and kids. But with other things like COVID and things like that, is being able to take away the threat as much as possible and focus on what can I do in this moment that helps, and
Yes.
what did my instincts say to do that may not help, that I need to kind of wait out and decide to, okay, let me use the rational side of my brain to solve this problem rather than make it worse. And we're all guilty of doing things that make it worse because we're humans, and if it's
Mm-hmm.
about a threat, then our brains don't distinguish between being annoyed at something and something being a threat, and it's likely to respond very quickly, and we have to apologize sometimes for things that we say, and we do. So it's really about stepping back and recognizing what the strategy is that takes away the threat for both parties, in this case of the parent and the child.
Well, I look forward to those conversations. Do you want to say a little bit about what we might, we'll be doing this subject. We'll be doing the parenting.
Definitely doing the parenting. Well, we can talk about COVID. We can talk about really just the social and political unrest that's going on. You talk about threats to somebody's way of life or their values. There's a lot of fear out there right now. There's a lot of emotion, on both sides of those kinds of issues. We talk about sports, stress in sports, and how anxiety and stress can create problems for parents and children, and how to sort of respond to those kinds of things. One of the things that we're going to look at is the idea of moral injury. A lot of people that are working are being asked to do things that are against their belief systems in order to better the company. Doctoring books and just doing things, not being honest in sales and things like that, that people are having to deal with this imbalance of, this just doesn't feel right to be able to do this. I wanted to work in a situation where I felt good about it. I just don't feel good about it. They have to balance between getting a paycheck and continuing the lifestyle that they have, and making a decision that may be against their moral judgment. So that's one of the topics that we'll talk about. Really anything that has to do with the stress that we're living with today is fair game. And we want people to respond and let us know through Facebook and other means, what kind of topics would you like for us to talk about?
Marriage would be a possibility.
Absolutely. Marriage,
Yeah.
Any kind of relationship issues. That's all I can think of right now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, we'll get a whole list. This is good. Let's just stop the recording here. We can edit
okay.
this.